"I don't know what the future holds," Jake said, his voice rough. But the weight of it was lighter than it had been in a long time. "But I know I don't want to waste any more time. Not anymore." Lila's smile softened, the edges of it touching her eyes. "Then let's stop looking back," she whispered, "and start looking forward." And in that moment, with the night air settling around them, Jake knew that the healing had begun. Not just for the town, not just for the shop, but for the two of them. They had finally found a way to move forward, not with regret, but with the kind of hope that only comes after healing. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The air in the shop was thick with the scent of fresh oil and sawdust, the hum of the radio barely reaching through the weight of silence between them. Jake wiped his hands on his rag, his eyes catching the soft glow of the overhead lights as he glanced toward the door. Lila stood in the doorway, framed by the fading daylight, her figure casting a long shadow across the floor. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, as if letting the quiet between them settle, as if giving him space to breathe. He felt a shift inside himself, something that had been building for weeks, months, maybe even years. He had spent so long trapped in his own fear, telling himself that he wasn't enough, that his life couldn't be more than what it was. But today, standing in front of him, was the woman who had shown him the possibility of more, who had come back, not just for the town, not just for the project, but for him. And now, here they were. Lila took a step inside, her eyes locking with his. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no wall between them, only the soft understanding that had grown between them over the past few weeks. She wasn't asking for him to choose her, not in the way she had before. She wasn't asking him to leave the world he had built for something unknown. She was asking him to stay, to build something with her, to choose this, choose them. "I don't want to keep looking at the past anymore," Jake said, his voice rough but steady. "I don't want to keep pretending that I can't be more than this, more than what I've always known." Lila nodded, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to be. You already are." He stepped closer to her, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. As he crossed the distance between them, the air between them shifted, charged with everything they hadn't said, everything that had been unsaid for so long. But it wasn't just about fixing things. It was about starting over, not from scratch, not from nothing, but from what they had now, what they had built. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers. "I'm not running anymore," he whispered, the weight of the words sinking in. She squeezed his hand, the quiet connection between them grounding him. "Neither am I." They didn't need words anymore. They didn't need to explain everything, to fix every mistake or fill every gap. They only needed to move forward, together. And when Jake looked around at the space, at the garage, at the lot where Lila's school was rising, at the place where their lives had finally collided, he realized something. This wasn't just about rebuilding a garage or a school. It was about rebuilding a life, their life. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something out of reach. It felt like home. It felt like now. "We'll make it work," Jake said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Not just the shop, not just the school. Us. All of it." Lila's eyes softened, a mixture of relief and hope flashing across her face. "All of it," she echoed. And for the first time, they both knew that whatever came next, whatever they built together, it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be everything they had ever wanted. He thought she was just another rich stranger with car trouble. He didn't recognize the woman who once sat beside him in a college lecture hall quietly in love. Now she's a billionaire, and she's about to change his life forever. But not before uncovering the heartbreak he never knew he caused. If you've ever wondered what it means to get a second chance with the one who got away, this is a story that will stay with you. Stick around. This isn't just about love lost. It's about rediscovering who we are when the past returns, not with regret, but with purpose. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The late afternoon sun hung low over the winding country road, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Heat shimmered off the pavement, warping the distant view like a mirage. A sleek silver car sat idle on the roadside, hood propped open, steam curling into the humid air like a ghost trying to escape. Jake Marshall spotted it from a distance as he rumbled along in his beat-up blue truck, the kind that had seen better decades. He squinted through the dusty windshield, slowing down instinctively. This stretch of road didn't get much traffic. And a car like that, a luxury coupe, low to the ground, polished to perfection, was out of place here, like a swan lost in the middle of a cattle ranch. He pulled over, gravel crunching beneath his tires, and stepped out. Boots hitting the road with a dull thud, Jake wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his back pocket. A woman stood by the car, arms folded, heels tapping lightly on the dirt, eyes fixed on the steam as if glaring at it might fix the problem. "You all right there?" Jake asked, approaching slowly. She turned toward him, and for a moment he felt something strange in his gut. Not recognition exactly, but a flicker, like a song you've heard once but can't place. She had dark eyes, sharp and observant, but not cold. Her features were calm, composed, even though her car was fuming, like it was about to catch fire. "Engine started overheating about 10 minutes ago. I pulled over as soon as the light came on," she said. Her voice was smooth, practiced, controlled. Jake nodded, moving past her to peek under the hood. "You did the right thing. Radiator's boiling. She's not going anywhere for a bit." "I figured," she replied, exhaling, but her tone carried something else. Frustration layered with disappointment. He crouched beside the front tire, examining the undercarriage. "You waiting on someone?" "No," she said after a pause. "Just passing through. I didn't expect to get stuck here." Jake shot her a sideways glance. "Maple Ridge isn't exactly where most people end up by accident." She hesitated. "I used to live nearby, a long time ago." He didn't ask more. Some stories introduced themselves when they were ready. Instead, he went back to work, hands steady, eyes scanning for damage. What he didn't see, what he couldn't have seen, was the way she watched him. Not just curious, not just grateful. She was remembering him. The hiss of steam slowed as the engine cooled, but the tension in the air didn't. Jake leaned in under the hood, sleeves rolled up, calloused hands moving with a quiet confidence. Years of doing this, getting his knuckles scraped, breathing in the scent of scorched oil, had given him an ease most people didn't notice. But she noticed. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the way his brow furrowed as he checked the hoses and clamps, the way he muttered softly under his breath when something wasn't quite right. His hair was longer now, scruffier than she remembered, and the sun had turned his skin a shade darker. But it was still him. Jake. He hadn't changed his walk. That same grounded stride, like every step mattered. That same voice, low, calm, steady. She remembered it from the library, from long nights sitting side by side, studying in silence, while her heart beat too fast. And now here he was, grease on his cheek, sweat beating at his temple, completely unaware. He glanced up. "You've got a cracked reservoir. That's what's leaking. Probably been like that for a while, just hadn't hit the boiling point until now." She didn't answer right away, caught in the pull of 100 old memories. A breathless laugh in a lecture hall, a shared umbrella in a sudden spring downpour, a letter she wrote but never sent. "I can get a temporary fix going, enough to get you back on the road, at least to town," he added, still crouched beneath the open hood. "That would be great. Thank you." Her voice nearly caught on the words. Jake nodded and turned back to the engine, completely at ease, completely in the dark. She hadn't expected this. A flat tire, maybe. An overheated engine, sure. But not him. Not here, not now. After everything she had built, everything she had tried to forget. Watching him now, she wasn't sure if she was grateful for the timing or terrified of it, because part of her, buried beneath years of silence and success, had never really stopped wondering, what if he'd loved her back? The first time she saw him again, it was like time folded in on itself. Not the man crouched under the hood now, covered in grease and concentration. Not the sunburned mechanic with a faint smudge on his cheek. No. When Lila had stepped out of her car and seen him walking toward her, she had seen something else entirely. A younger man, sitting across from her in a dusty lecture hall, scribbling notes with his left hand and spinning a pencil with his right. The same easy confidence, the same eyes, deep, unreadable, like he carried the weight of something he'd never talk about. Jake. It hit her so fast she couldn't breathe. She had rehearsed this moment in her head more times than she'd ever admit, what she'd say, how she'd say it, how it would feel to finally stand in front of the one person who'd haunted the edges of her memory for more than a decade. But now that it was real, now that he was standing just feet away, raking his hand through his hair like he always used to, she said nothing. He didn't recognize her, not even a flicker of hesitation in his voice, not even a second glance. And maybe that hurt more than she was willing to admit. She told herself it made sense. She looked different now. The girl she used to be had soft edges and second-hand sweaters. Lila now wore tailored coats and heels that clicked like certainty. Her hair, once wild with waves, was pinned neatly behind her ears. Her voice, once hesitant, was now smooth, trained for boardrooms and negotiations. Of course, he didn't recognize her, but still, part of her had hoped. As he worked, she watched every movement, fighting the twist in her chest. He had been her friend once, maybe almost something more. She had written that letter with shaking hands, sealing every word with hope. And when he never showed, never answered, she'd folded that version of herself into a box and buried it beneath ambition. Now here he was, alive in the flesh, asking about car trouble like nothing had ever passed between them. Maybe for him, nothing had. Jake tightened the last bolt and closed the hood with a heavy thud, wiping his hands on the rag stuffed in his back pocket. The steam had finally stopped, but the tension between them hadn't. He turned to her, not smiling exactly, but with that same quiet calm that used to make her feel steadier, back when the world felt too big. "You're good to go," he said, nodding toward the car. Lila stepped closer, slipping her hand into the side pocket of her coat. She pulled out her wallet, sleek, black leather, the kind that usually made people pause. She didn't flash it, just opened it calmly, and began sliding out a few crisp bills. "How much?" she asked. Jake blinked. "Nothing." She hesitated. "What do you mean, nothing?" "You've been out here for nearly an hour," he shrugged. "It was a simple fix. Patched the crack well enough to get you to town. Harrison's shop will have the part in stock if you're staying local." Lila looked down at the money in her hand, then back up at him. "Jake." She stopped herself, quickly correcting. "Sorry, I didn't catch your name earlier." "Jake," he said unfazed. "Jake Marshall." Of course it was. Of course he still didn't remember her. "Well, Jake, I insist, really." He shook his head and stepped back. "Nah, I don't take money for roadside fixes. It's just how we do things around here." She stared at him, the bill still in her hand. Not because she was stunned by the gesture, she could afford to pay him 10 times over, but because in that moment she saw something that hadn't changed. Despite everything life must have thrown at him, the calluses on his hands, the worn threads on his shirt, the quiet tiredness in his eyes, he was still that guy, the one who let her borrow his notes without hesitation, the one who once offered her half his sandwich without asking if she was hungry. He hadn't hardened. "Thank you," she said quietly, folding the money back into her wallet. Jake nodded, already heading toward his truck. "Drive safe." She watched him walk away, the sound of his boots against gravel fading, and all she could think was that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't forgotten how to be good. even if he had forgotten her. He was already halfway to his truck when she called out to him. "Wait!" Jake turned, wiping his palms against his jeans. The sun had dipped lower, bleeding orange across the horizon, casting his face in a warm glow. He looked back at her with that same calm patience that had followed him through everything he did, as if nothing ever rattled him, just like she remembered. She stepped closer, the gravel crunching under her designer boots, so wildly out of place on this dusty road that she suddenly felt foolish for wearing them. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. She didn't know why she had stopped him. Maybe it was the sting of him not recognizing her. Maybe it was the ache that had been building since the moment he knelt beside her car. "Thanks again," she said, "for helping. I didn't expect to break down out here." "Yeah," he replied, hooking a thumb through a belt loop. "Not the best place to stall out. Could have been worse, though." She smiled faintly, unsure what she was doing. The silence stretched between them, the kind that used to live in library corners and unspoken feelings. It pulsed now, charged. He looked at her curiously. "You said you used to live around here?" "I did," she said softly. "It's been a long time." Jake nodded like that explained something. "Most people don't come back once they leave this place. Not unless they have to." She glanced down, the hesitation returning like a wave. Her name sat on the edge of her tongue, but something held it back. If she said it, Lila Whitmore, he'd know. Or maybe he wouldn't. And somehow that scared her more. He'd moved on, clearly. Maybe she should too. But she couldn't lie. Not to him. Not even now. "Lila," she finally said. "My name's Lila." There was a flicker in his eyes, barely noticeable. A second of pause, like something almost surfaced before slipping back under. "Well," he said, offering a nod. "Safe travels, Lila." And just like that, he turned and walked away. She drove slowly after she left the roadside, the silence in the car louder than the engine. Her hands stayed tight on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, but her mind was already drifting, slipping backward through time into places she hadn't let herself go in years. The college library, that old corner table by the windows, with the cracked leather chairs and a view of the campus lawn. That's where they always met, not because they planned to, but because they both needed the quiet. He was always there first, pencil in hand, a half-empty coffee beside his notes. He never made a big deal when she sat beside him, never asked why she always came, but he shared his space, his silence, sometimes his smile. She had fallen for him there, quietly and without permission. Not all at once, but in pieces. The way he pulled his hood up when he studied. The way he tapped his foot when he was deep in thought. The way he let her copy his notes during finals week without ever making her feel small for needing help. There was one night she remembered more clearly than the rest. Midterms, rain drumming against the library windows. He had brought 2 sandwiches, handed her one without a word. She'd never told him how much that meant. How at that time her meal plan had run out and her bank account was nearly empty. He never asked questions, and she never said thank you. She had wanted to tell him how she felt. There were nights she'd stayed up rehearsing it, writing and rewriting the words in her head. Eventually, she wrote a letter. Honest, awkward, hopeful. She left it for him in his mailbox at the student center. She waited for him to say something, anything, but he never came. 2 weeks later, she was gone, offered a full scholarship at a university on the other side of the country. It was a chance she couldn't refuse, but the goodbye she never got stayed with her. Even now, as the road curved and the sun slipped behind the trees, that old hurt sat in her chest like a bruise that never quite healed. He hadn't even remembered her name. The next morning started the way they all did for Jake, early, quiet, and heavy. The garage was already open by 7. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, catching the flecks of metal and grease that hung in the air like ash. The space was cramped and aging. The old lift groaned whenever it rose, and the heater rattled louder than it worked. But it was his, or had become his, whether he was ready for it or not. He wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back from the undercarriage of an old truck, the engine coughing like it hadn't breathed properly in years. He took a sip of burnt coffee from the chipped mug on the workbench and glanced around the shop. Same smell. Same tools hanging in the same spots his father used to keep them. It had been almost 5 years since the heart attack. Jake had come home that night to find the lights still on in the shop. His father collapsed just beside the lift, wrench still clutched in his hand. After the funeral, Jake never left. Not because he had planned it, not because it made sense, but because someone had to stay. He wasn't alone. "Uncle Jake," a small voice called from the back room, breaking his thoughts. Sam came running in, backpack half-zipped, dragging a peanut butter-stained homework folder in one hand. "You eat breakfast?" Jake asked, without looking up. "Granola bar," Sam mumbled. "Kind of. I think it was expired." Jake sighed. "We'll grab something better on the way to school." Sam nodded, already halfway to the old beat-up couch in the corner where he liked to watch cartoons on the cracked TV Jake could never quite justify replacing. The boy had been through enough. Losing both parents in the accident had left scars Jake didn't know how to heal. So he did the only thing he could. He stayed. He worked. He kept the lights on. Barely. Every day felt like a race against bills and breakdowns. Some nights he counted quarters just to put gas in the truck. But he never let Sam see the cracks. The kid deserved better than that. Jake rolled up his sleeves again and returned to the truck, hands steady, eyes tired. He didn't dream like he used to. That version of himself, the one with plans, ambition, maybe even love, had been left behind somewhere between grief and survival. But he could still fix things, one job at a time, one bolt at a time. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. Lila sat in the back of the black SUV as it rolled past the edge of Maple Ridge, the hum of the engine muffled against the silence in her head. Her assistant tapped away quietly on a tablet beside her, updating schedules and sending off emails, but Lila barely noticed. She was staring out the tinted window, watching her past slip back into view, one cracked sidewalk and rusted mailbox at a time. It had been 12 years. The buildings were smaller than she remembered. The gas station still had the faded sign that creaked in the wind. The diner still sat on the corner with the same peeling paint and crooked blinds. It was all here, untouched by time and somehow heavier because of it. "Miss Whitmore, the zoning rep confirmed your walkthrough for tomorrow morning. Would you like me to push the board call?" her assistant asked, glancing over. "No, keep it," Lila replied. Her voice was composed, clipped, the way it always was when she was trying to outrun emotion. She hadn't told anyone of the full reason she was coming back. Not the board, not her assistant, not even the press who kept speculating about her next move. The story they were fed was clean. The CEO of tech giant Virion Labs was investing in her hometown. A charitable land redevelopment project, build a school, revitalize the community, create opportunity. But the truth was messier. It wasn't about land. It was about closure. She had built an empire on code and vision, on late nights and boardroom battles. She'd broken barriers and stock records, made headlines and enemies. But nothing she'd built, not the high-rise offices, not the billion-dollar acquisitions, had ever quieted the question that still pulsed in the quiet. What would have happened if he had answered? Jake Marshall, the boy who had made her believe she could be seen before the world knew her name. The boy who had left her waiting, alone with a letter in her hand and hope curdling in her chest. She was back now, with power, money, and control over everything, except the feeling that somehow, even after everything, she still needed to know why he never came, and if she was being honest, whether he even remembered her at all. Lila stood at the edge of the vacant lot, arms folded across her chest as the wind tugged at her coat. The land had once belonged to the Whitmore family, 3 overgrown acres of weeds, broken fence posts, and memories she hadn't dared touch until now. In the distance, the town stretched quietly under the pale morning sky, the rooftops of Maple Ridge unchanged, like a photo frozen in time. She should have felt proud. In just over a year, this place would be transformed. A state-of-the-art learning center, tech labs, mentorship spaces, scholarships for the local kids. A gift to the town that raised her. A legacy with her name on the cornerstone. But pride wasn't what sat in her chest. It was the letter. She had written it during her last week of college, in a dorm room emptied of everything but nerves and the ache of goodbye. Jake had missed her subtle hints, the long looks, the jokes that landed a little too soft. So she wrote everything down, how she felt, how she wanted him to come with her, or at least meet her halfway. She told him he mattered, that maybe what they had wasn't nothing, even if it had never been said aloud. She left it in his mailbox the day she left, and waited, and waited. He never came. For years, she'd told herself it didn't matter, that she'd moved on, outgrown that version of herself, the girl who believed in love letters and daydreams. She buried it under work, under the titles and IPOs and Forbes lists. But some wounds don't heal when ignored. They just grow quieter. Why hadn't he answered? Had he read it and thrown it away? Had he laughed? Or had it simply never mattered to him the way it did to her? That question had haunted her more than she'd ever admit. And now, after seeing him again, alive, real, and unchanged in ways that made her chest ache, the question roared back to life. Did he forget? Or did he choose not to remember? She needed to know, not because she was still that girl, but because she couldn't fully become the woman she'd become until she finally closed the door that had never been locked, only left ajar. Jake was under the hood of an old Ford when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the garage. He didn't look up right away. He was elbow-deep in a stubborn alternator and already running behind on 2 other jobs. But something about the sound made him pause. Too smooth, too expensive. Not the kind of vehicle that usually pulled into his shop. He wiped his hands and stepped out into the sunlight, squinting toward the entrance. There she was. Lila. He blinked once, unsure if he was seeing right. Same sharp eyes, same calm expression. Dressed in a cream blazer that looked more at home in a boardroom than anywhere near motor oil. She stood next to the same silver coupe he'd patched up days ago, arms resting lightly on the roof, like she wasn't entirely sure why she was there. Jake raised a brow, surprised but not unfriendly. "Didn't think I'd see you again?" She offered a small smile, controlled and unreadable. "Car's been acting up again. Thought I'd come to the expert." He walked over slowly, towel still in hand. "That quick, huh? Should have charged you after all." She let out a soft laugh. It sounded honest. "Would you believe me if I said I just happened to be passing through again?" "No," he said plainly, then smiled, "but I'll take a look anyway." Lila nodded, but she didn't move toward the car. Instead, she stayed there, just watching him. Something about him, his ease, his groundedness, felt like a different language compared to the polished, ruthless energy of the people she usually dealt with. Jake circled the front of the car and popped the hood, glancing over his shoulder. "Still overheating?" She shook her head. "No, just noisy. Thought maybe something got missed." He didn't call her out, didn't ask questions, just nodded and got to work. But as he leaned back into the engine, Lila stood in silence, heart pounding harder than she expected. She wasn't here for the car. Not really. She needed to see him again. And she needed to know what kind of man Jake Marshall had become, because part of her still wasn't sure if she wanted closure or a reason to stay. The day was fading fast, the light softening as the evening crept in. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and leaned against the worn workbench, catching his breath. He hadn't expected the day to stretch on this long, but it had. When you owned a garage, time didn't always follow your schedule. But Lila had stayed, hadn't left after the engine check like most customers did. She sat across from him now, sipping a coffee from the thermos he'd offered her, eyes scanning the shelves lined with old parts and rusted tools. Her silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was a quiet understanding, like 2 people who had nothing in common, yet knew the value of simply existing in the same space. "You really haven't changed much, have you?" she said, her voice low, almost to herself. Jake looked up from the engine manual he'd been absent-mindedly flipping through. "What do you mean?" She glanced up then, meeting his eyes. "You're still here, still fixing things. People." He chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "What can I say? Some of us don't make it out." His gaze dropped, almost instinctively, to the faded photograph of his father on the wall beside him. It had been years since he let himself think about what might have been, what could have been. Lila's smile was faint, but it wasn't the pitying smile he expected. It was something else. Understanding, or maybe just shared loss. "You've built something here," she said, almost as if to herself. "A life." Jake didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. Instead, he picked up a rag, absent-mindedly wiping down the counter. Her presence was beginning to settle under his skin in a way he hadn't expected. She didn't ask for anything, she didn't push. And yet, he felt this unspoken weight hanging between them. "I had a lot of plans when I was younger," he finally admitted, breaking the silence. "I thought I was going to do more than this." She nodded, leaning back in her chair, eyes still steady on him. "We all do." "Guess we end up where we're meant to," he said, the words almost bitter in their simplicity. Lila didn't speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. "I don't know about that," she said, staring into her coffee like she was weighing the truth of her own words. "Some of us are just waiting." Jake raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving her. "Waiting for what?" Her eyes met his again, briefly, before dropping. "For something to remind us who we used to be, or maybe just who we could have been." She let the words linger in the air like a question neither of them wanted to answer. He swallowed, something tight in his chest. The flicker of recognition, the feeling that he should know her, that he did know her, nagged at him again. But it didn't settle. He couldn't place it. Couldn't understand why it felt like something was slipping just out of reach. "I don't know about all that," he muttered, looking away. "But I know how to fix a car when it breaks, and that's enough for me." She didn't respond. Instead, she studied him for a moment, like she was searching for something, or maybe just waiting, like she'd said. Jake wasn't sure, but the question that had been eating at him finally slipped out before he could stop it. "Why did you leave, Lila?" Her name sounded different now, like a door that had been left ajar for too long. She met his eyes again, and for a second he could almost see it. The girl he remembered, the one who'd written that letter. But it was gone, before he could grab hold of it. "I had to," she said softly, standing up slowly, "just like you had to stay." Jake didn't have an answer to that. Maybe he never would. Lila stood at the entrance of the old library, the massive oak doors creaking slightly as she pushed them open. The air inside was thick with the musty scent of old pages and ink, a smell that used to bring her comfort, used to make her feel like she was on the cusp of something new, something big. But now it felt more like a weight, a reminder of a time when she thought she had all the answers. The library was quieter than it used to be, the shelves still filled with the same worn books, but the room felt different, less alive, less full of the energy that had once pulsed through its walls. She walked slowly between the aisles, fingers brushing against the spines, a distant echo of the nights she'd spent here, sitting next to Jake at their usual table by the windows. They had studied together, laughed together, shared secrets, between textbooks. There had been something simple, something easy about those moments. It had felt like the world was wide open, and they were both just stepping into it side by side. But that was before everything changed, before she left, before the scholarship and the promise of a new life on the other side of the country, before the letter she wrote, the one she poured her heart into, filled with words that never made it to him. She stopped at the window by their table, the one they used to sit at, in silence, except for the occasional soft conversation. The sunlight filtered through the glass, casting long shadows across the wooden floors, and for a second it was like she could see them both there again, their books scattered between them, their future stretching out like an endless horizon. But then the memory soured, just as it always did. He hadn't come, not for her, not for the letter. The words she'd written, the hope that had bloomed in her chest, had meant nothing to him. She had left, thinking she would come back, thinking things would be different when she returned, but they weren't. He hadn't even remembered her name, hadn't even remembered her letter. And now, standing here, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that had never come to be, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she'd built, everything she'd become, had been built on something broken. She had thought he would be a part of it, but she was the only one who had carried that weight, the only one who had kept waiting, kept wondering. Why? She stepped away from the window, the ache in her chest growing sharper. The silence in the room felt oppressive now. The library wasn't just a place for learning. It was a place of lost dreams, of unanswered questions. And she had no answers, only this endless knot in her stomach, reminding her that some things, some people, could never be fixed. Jake leaned against the workbench, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The garage was quiet for once, the steady hum of a broken-down truck his only company. He had just finished replacing a part he had been putting off for days, the engine still cold from the earlier repairs. He set down the wrench, his eyes scanning the cluttered shelves, the half-empty toolboxes, and piles of forgotten parts scattered across the dusty floor. His hand brushed against something unfamiliar, an envelope tucked under a stack of receipts in the corner of the drawer. It was out of place. Not the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a shop like his. He pulled it free, fingers catching the edge of the yellowed paper, the name on the front in neat, looping script. Lila Whitmore. He froze. The name hit him like a punch to the gut, memories he had buried for so long surging to the surface. Her, the girl from college, the one he had forgotten, or tried to, the one who had left without a word, without explanation, the one who had written him a letter he had never received. The envelope looked ancient, like it had been forgotten by time itself. The edges were worn, frayed from age. He hadn't thought about her in years, hadn't wondered what might have been if he had just taken the time to read whatever she had written. Maybe it didn't matter, maybe it never had. But his hands trembled as he held the envelope, the weight of it settling heavily in his palm. There was something about this moment, the way it felt like fate had placed this forgotten piece of his past in his hands. He turned the envelope over, as if it might give him an answer just by looking at the back. But there was nothing. No return address, no sign that it had ever been opened. Jake swallowed hard, staring at the letter like it was a ghost. Why hadn't he opened it? Why had it sat in this drawer all these years, tucked away with forgotten receipts and broken parts? His thoughts swirled, and the questions piled on top of each other. Did she still think about him? Had she regretted leaving without a word? Was this letter the reason she had come back into his life? He could feel his heart beating faster, the old emotions that had never fully faded rising to the surface. He hadn't expected to find this today. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it either. But now that he had it, he couldn't leave it unread. With a sigh, he tore open the envelope. Jake sat at the workbench, the letter in his hands, the words on the page blurring as his mind struggled to piece together what he was reading. Lila's handwriting, so familiar and tender, held the same weight it had when he first saw it, the same sincerity he remembered in her eyes when they sat side by side in the library. She had written to him. She had poured herself into this letter, and yet, somehow, it had never reached him. His chest tightened as he reread the last line, the one that left no doubt in his mind about how she had felt, how she still felt. The letter was full of everything he had wanted to hear, everything he had needed to know all those years ago. He could feel the edges of regret gnawing at him, They what-ifs stacking up one after another, like a mountain he had no idea how to climb. The noise of the world outside the garage felt distant, muffled, like he was underwater. His eyes drifted from the letter to the empty space in front of him, the tools hanging on the wall in perfect, unchanging order. Everything in the garage was still, and yet everything had shifted in an instant. Jake sat frozen, the letter trembling in his grip, until a soft voice broke the silence. "You found it." He turned slowly, his heart skipping at the sight of his mother standing in the doorway. She was older now, her hair graying at the temples, but the lines on her face hadn't changed. She was still the woman who had kept everything together after his father's death, who had kept the house running and the bills paid, while Jake tried to hold on to the remnants of his childhood. She had always been the strong one, the one who never let him see the cracks. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the letter in his hands. His mother stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. "I didn't want you to be distracted," she said, her voice low, almost apologetic. "You had enough on your plate already. After everything happened, I didn't think it was the right time. I thought it would pull you away from the work you had to do, from what you needed to focus on." Jake's stomach churned, the pieces starting to fit together in a way he wasn't ready for. Mom, you hid it? You kept it from me?" She nodded slowly, her eyes lowering. "I didn't want to. But I thought you'd throw it all away. I thought you'd lose sight of what was in front of you. Your father's death hit you hard, and I couldn't let you lose your focus. I needed you here with me, with us. I couldn't afford to let you drift away." The weight of her words sank in, and Jake felt a sharp sting in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was betrayal or heartbreak or something deeper, something that had been buried for too long. "You should have told me," he whispered, the letter now feeling heavier in his hands. "You should have let me decide." His mother's gaze softened, her shoulders sagging with the weight of years of regret. I know I should have." Jake ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. All these years, and he had never known that the one person who had meant everything to him had reached out, had tried to bridge the gap, only to have it all crushed by someone he had trusted to protect him. "Do you think," his voice faltered, "do you think I would have chosen differently? If I'd known?" His mother didn't answer right away. She took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You were always the one who wanted to stay grounded, to keep things simple. But maybe that's just the way life is, Jake. You don't always get to choose when or how things happen." Jake shook his head, the frustration building like a pressure he couldn't release. The truth hit him like a wave, but it didn't bring clarity. Only more questions, and now, with the letter in his hand, he wasn't sure where to go from here. The rain came down hard, the kind that soaked through your clothes in minutes, turning the world around them into a blur of gray and white. Jake stood under the awning of the garage, his arms crossed over his chest, watching as the water pooled at his feet, the rhythm of it echoing in the quiet of the night. The storm had rolled in fast, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. But it wasn't the storm that had his heart racing. It was Lila. She stood a few feet away, her face shadowed by the hood of her jacket, the rain drenching her hair and clinging to the strands that framed her face. She had been standing there for minutes, neither of them speaking, just the sound of the rain between them. Lila shifted her weight, then finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "You probably don't remember me, do you?" Jake frowned, the question cutting through the haze of his own thoughts. He had asked himself the same thing for the past few days. Why had she come back? But now, hearing her ask, the weight of it hit him hard. He could barely place her face, let alone the voice that sounded so familiar. He felt the flicker of recognition gnawing at the back of his mind, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He stopped himself, unsure how to answer. He was staring at her, but the truth was, something about her unsettled him. There was a quiet intensity in the way she stood there, like she had a secret she was just waiting to drop. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, his voice distant, defensive. Lila took a step forward, her wet hair plastered to her face, her expression both distant and desperate. "Jake," she said, this time clearer, the name falling from her lips like it was supposed to be a revelation. "It's me, Lila, from college." The world seemed to stop. The name hit him like a sucker punch. He could feel his throat tighten, the air in his lungs suddenly thick and suffocating. His chest went cold, then hot, as everything he thought he'd left behind rushed back. Lila, the girl who had written him that letter, the girl he had let slip away without ever knowing why. Her face was familiar now, her eyes full of something he didn't understand, a mixture of longing, regret, and something else he couldn't name. But in her eyes there was no mistaking it. She wasn't just someone from his past. She was the past he had buried, the one that had never let him go. Lila seemed to read the confusion in his expression, the way his face faltered as he tried to piece it together. Her gaze softened, and for a moment she looked almost vulnerable. "You don't remember, do you?" she whispered, the rain washing away the last remnants of the distance between them. Jake stood frozen, caught in the storm, in the silence between them. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the confusion, the shame that was building in his chest? "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice low, cracking under the weight of everything unsaid. "I wrote you a letter, Jake. I left, but I thought about you every day. I thought you might feel the same way." She swallowed hard, as though the words were cutting through her, as much as they were him. "But you never answered, and I never knew why." Jake's heart ached with something he couldn't name. He wanted to speak, but the words never came. Instead, he just stood there, drenched, staring at her, feeling the years of silence closing in around him. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely more than a breath, the weight of the past pressing down on him. Lila shook her head, the rain mixing with the tears she hadn't meant to shed. "You don't have to apologize," she said quietly, the words breaking free. "I just needed you to know who I am. I never stopped wondering if we could have been something different, something more." And just like that, the rain seemed to drown everything else out. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, soft against the cracked pavement, as they stood there in the growing quiet, neither of them moving. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. His hands were still shaking slightly, his fingers cold, and wet from the rain that clung to him. He hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected her to return, not like this, not after all these years. Lila took a deep breath, the silence too much to bear. Her eyes were still full of that quiet ache, a look that somehow mirrored the one he hadn't known how to shake all these years. Her voice came out softer than he'd expected, like she was finally letting herself ask a question she'd carried for too long. "Why didn't you come, Jake?" Her words were simple, but they hit him like a sledgehammer, the raw pain of them crashing against him, making his breath catch in his throat. He stared at her, the weight of the question hanging between them, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had thought of her often. How could he not? She had been the one he'd never been able to forget, the one who had always lingered in the corners of his mind. But he never answered her letter, never gave her what she needed. I didn't know what to say," he finally stammered, the truth tasting bitter on his tongue. "I didn't know what you wanted from me. You left. I never thought—" His voice faltered as he searched for the right words, but none of them felt like enough. "I never thought you'd come back." Lila's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she wiped them away quickly, like she was trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "I came back because I never stopped thinking about you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came back because I thought maybe, just maybe, you would feel the same." Jake felt his chest tighten, a rush of guilt hitting him all at once. The pain in her voice, the way she was standing there in the rain, soaked and vulnerable. It broke something inside him. He had thought she'd moved on. He had thought she had left him behind like so many others had. But this was real. She was here, standing in front of him, asking the one question he could never answer. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I'm so sorry, Lila." Her gaze softened for a moment, but there was a sadness in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. "I waited for you. I waited for so long, Jake, and you never came." The truth hit him with such force that it took his breath away. He had let her wait. He had let the silence grow between them, built on all the things he couldn't say, the things he wasn't strong enough to face. And now, as the rain continued to fall, all he had was regret. All he had was the memory of the girl who had loved him, the woman who had come back to find him. But it was too late. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, the words sounding hollow even to him. You just let me go," she interrupted, her voice cracking. She looked away, her shoulders shaking with the weight of it all. "And I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd fight for us. But you didn't." Jake stood there, feeling more broken than he had in years. He had never fought. He had never even tried to keep her. And now, as the distance between them grew, he realized it wasn't the storm that hurt the most. It was the storm they'd never weathered together. The rain had stopped, but the air between them was still thick, like the weight of the past had settled around them, heavier than the storm ever could. Jake ran his hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. The words that had been sitting in his chest for years were spilling out now, but they didn't feel like relief. They felt like a wound that had just been reopened. "We're from two different worlds now, Lila," he said, the words coming out raw, unpolished, but they felt true. "I can't pretend like we're not." Lila's face twisted, something fragile breaking in her expression. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but she closed it again, struggling to find the right words. Her eyes flickered from his face to the ground, and then back to him, like she was trying to figure out how to bridge the distance that had always been there, even when they were together. "I don't believe that," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a hint of frustration that had been building between them ever since she'd shown up. "You think we're from different worlds, but you never gave us the chance to find out if we were." Jake stepped back, putting a hand on the edge of the workbench to steady himself. The anger in her voice was unfamiliar, but it made something inside of him flare to life. He didn't want to be angry. He didn't want to fight with her. But what choice did he have? "You don't get it," he muttered, shaking his head. "You've built this life. You're a billionaire, Lila. You have all this success, all this power. And I'm still here, in this damn garage, trying to fix cars just to get by. You think we're ever going to fit together after all that?" Lila's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing as she took a step forward. "I didn't come back here for you to talk like that. You think I'm some stranger, that everything I've done, everything I've worked for, makes me someone different? You think I'm going to just forget who I was before all of this?" She gestured around them, the garage, the small-town life. "I'm the same person, Jake. I always have been." Jake's heart raced, and for the first time, he felt the weight of everything between them. It wasn't just the time that had passed. It wasn't just the distance between their worlds, the money, the success. It was the things they had never said to each other, the things they had never dealt with. "You're not the same person," he said, his voice quiet now, like the fight had left him. "You're not. You can't be." The words felt like a confession, something buried deep inside him that he had been too afraid to say. It wasn't just the difference in their lives. It was the years of silence, the time they had lost, the way she had walked away without ever looking back. And now, as she stood in front of him, full of hope and strength, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something they couldn't go back from. Lila took another step forward, her face softening, but the hurt in her eyes was still there. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I thought you didn't care." The words landed with a thud, and Jake felt the world tilt. "I always cared," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I didn't know how to fight for it." For a moment, neither of them spoke, just standing there in the stillness that followed. Jake felt the wall between them grow higher, stronger. He wanted to tear it down. He wanted to reach out and fix it, fix everything. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with all the years that had passed, all the things left unsaid. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if we can." Lila's eyes softened, but she didn't reach out. She just stood there, her arms at her sides, like she was waiting for him to make the next move, waiting for him to see what she saw. But Jake couldn't see it, not yet. And for the first time, he realized they might be too far gone to ever see eye to eye again. Jake sat at the kitchen table, the mug of coffee in front of him cooling faster than he could drink it. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Sam sat across from him, a bowl of cereal in front of him, pushing the milk around with a spoon like it was the most important thing in the world. Jake's mind was far from the small, quiet kitchen. It had been a few days since Lila had shown up at the garage, and the weight of their conversation still sat heavy on his chest. He hadn't slept well. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about what she had said, the way her eyes had looked when she asked why he hadn't come. The quiet hurt in her voice when she spoke about waiting, about wondering what could have been. He hadn't wanted to face it. He had buried it deep, buried her, buried everything. He'd told himself that he couldn't let her back in, that they were from different worlds, that they didn't fit anymore. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was scared, scared of what it meant to open up to her again, scared of what it meant to admit he'd never stopped caring. Sam set down his spoon and looked at Jake with an intensity that belied his age. "You're not fooling anyone, you know." Jake blinked, caught off guard by his nephew's sudden directness. "What do you mean?" Sam leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're doing that thing again, acting like nothing's wrong, like you've got everything under control when you don't. I've seen it before." Jake sighed, rubbing his hand over his face, trying to brush away the exhaustion that clung to him. "It's complicated, kid. It's always complicated." Sam's voice was soft but firm. "But that doesn't mean you should just keep pretending it doesn't matter. You can't keep running away from it." Jake looked up at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "I'm not running, Sam." "Yeah, you are," Sam said quietly, his eyes unwavering. "You've been running from her for years, and now she's back, and you're still trying to hide. But you can't keep pretending it's not there. You can't keep pretending she doesn't matter." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Sam was right. He had been running. For years he'd told himself that he didn't need her, that the life he had now was enough. But the truth was, he didn't know how to deal with what he felt for her, not after everything. And now, with her standing in front of him again, with the past rising up between them, he felt lost. Sam leaned forward, his voice quieter now, softer. "You can't keep pushing her away, Uncle Jake. You have to face it. You have to face her, or you're going to regret it." Jake's heart squeezed in his chest. He wasn't sure he could face it. He wasn't sure he could face her. But Sam was right. He had to stop hiding. He had to stop pretending he didn't care when he knew, deep down, he always had. Do you think it's too late?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam shrugged, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know, but you'll never know if you don't try." Jake stared at the table for a long moment, the silence between them stretching, the weight of everything settling into his bones. He didn't have all the answers. Hell, he didn't even know where to start. But one thing was clear. He couldn't keep running from this. Not anymore. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting against the harsh midday sun. The truck was barely running, the engine coughing as it sputtered through the rough gravel of the project site. He had been driving by this plot for weeks now, hearing the buzz of construction equipment and seeing the signs that promised new development. But today, something was different. He had expected a new housing development, maybe a few offices, but what he saw made his stomach drop. The land that had once been open, overgrown, and empty was now filled with machinery, workers, and scaffolding. They were building something bigger than he could have imagined. He parked the truck at the edge of the site and climbed out, his boots kicking up dust as he moved closer. The signs were clear now. Virion Academy, empowering the next generation. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The name on the sign sent a chill down his spine. Lila. He hadn't known what to expect when she returned. Hell, he hadn't known if she would even want to see him again. But this was something else entirely. He had always known she had big plans, had always known she was destined for greatness, but to see her name on this massive project, right next to his garage, it hit harder than he ever could have prepared for. The ground was being leveled for what looked like a campus, classrooms, a playground, maybe even dorms, a school. She was building a school here, and it wasn't just any school. It was the kind of place that would change the community, the kind of place that would lift this town up, bring in opportunities, jobs, a future. Jake stood there, his heart pounding, trying to wrap his mind around the sight. He wasn't prepared for it, wasn't prepared to feel the weight of what she had created, what she had built. "Hey, you the mechanic?" a voice called from behind him. Jake turned, seeing a construction worker walking toward him, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, that's me," Jake replied, his voice hoarse, the reality of the situation still sinking in. "The boss told me to let you know," the worker said, eyes scanning the site. "We're putting in a new road here. We might need to reroute a couple of things on your side. You'll have access, but it'll be a bit tighter for a while." Jake nodded absently, but his mind was miles away. The worker didn't seem to notice the way his gaze kept shifting toward the center of the site, toward the place where Lila's plans were taking shape. A school right next door. He swallowed hard, his chest tight. He hadn't even known. She hadn't told him. After all these years, after everything they had shared, everything they hadn't shared, she hadn't even considered telling him. The weight of it crushed him. She was building something bigger than either of them, something that would change everything about this town. And he was still here, stuck in the same place, his garage, his life, his small corner of the world. Jake clenched his fists at his sides, the old hurt flaring up again, the feeling of being left behind, the feeling of being too small for someone like her. She was out there, doing something that mattered, and he was here, buried in oil and grease, fixing broken engines. Without thinking, he turned and walked toward his truck. The project site loomed behind him like an open wound, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer part of her world. Not anymore. The air inside the garage was thick with the smell of grease and oil, the familiar scent that had never seemed to bother Jake until now. He stood by the workbench, wiping his hands on a rag, staring at the truck he'd been trying to fix all morning. The sounds of the world outside, traffic, workers, the low hum of the construction site next door, filtered in through the open door. He hadn't seen her in days, hadn't expected to. But now, standing in the doorway of his garage, Lila looked out of place and completely at home all at once. The cool breeze caught the edges of her coat, but her presence felt like the heat of the sun rising over a long, cold night. She was calm, composed, the kind of woman who could command attention without saying a word, but today she looked different. Not just the polished exterior he had seen before, but something more raw, more real. "Lila," he said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. He hadn't meant to sound so distant, but there it was. She was here, standing right in front of him again, and it was impossible to ignore the weight of everything between them. "Jake," she said, her voice steady. She didn't step inside, just lingered in the doorway, her eyes scanning the garage as though searching for something that hadn't been there before. She met his gaze again, and for a moment neither of them moved. "I need your help." Jake blinked, startled by the directness of her words. "Help?" he repeated, unsure if he'd heard her right. She nodded, her expression unwavering. "I'm building something here, a new community project. A school, but more than that. It's about giving people a chance, a real chance. But it's not just about the building. It's about everything that comes with it, the growth, the change. And I need someone who knows this town, someone who knows the people." Jake felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected her to ask anything of him, not after everything that had passed between them. "You want me to be a part of it? You want me to help you with the project?" Lila stepped closer, her voice softer now, almost as if she were trying to make sure her words didn't slip through his fingers. "I want you to lead it, Jake. I want you to help bring this town together, this place, you know it. You understand it in a way that no one else does. This project won't work without someone who cares about the people here, without someone who knows what they need." The words hung in the air between them, and Jake stood frozen, the weight of her request pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say, how to respond. She was asking him to step into something bigger than anything he had ever done before. "You're asking me to lead something," he said, his voice quieter now, a hint of disbelief threading through his words. "Me? After everything?" Lila met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I'm asking you because I know you can do it. You've spent your whole life fixing things, Jake. It's time to fix this, to make something better out of it. You're the heart of this place, whether you want to admit it or not." The words cut through him, and he felt something in him shift, something raw and unspoken breaking free. He didn't know if he could do this. He didn't know if he was the man she thought he was, the man who could change a town with nothing more than his hands. But as Lila stood there, looking at him with that quiet, unwavering faith in her eyes, Jake couldn't help but wonder if this was what he had been waiting for. Not just a chance to prove himself to her, but to finally prove something to himself. "I don't know if I'm the right guy for this," he said, his voice rough, "but I'll try. I'll try, Lila. I'll make it work." For the first time in what felt like years, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, relief, maybe, or hope. And as she turned to leave, she glanced back at him, offering a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," she said softly, before disappearing into the daylight, leaving Jake standing alone in the silence of the garage. The sun was already dipping low when Jake pulled into the construction site, his truck groaning as he parked it beside the growing structure that was soon to be a school. The site buzzed with activity, men and women moving around in the late afternoon light, carrying equipment and setting up new foundations. The hum of hard work was palpable, but as Jake stepped out of the truck, it didn't feel like the work itself was what weighed on him. It was the growing tension between him and Lila, the unspoken words that lingered between them like the dust in the air. He had been coming to the site every day for the past week, helping where he could, guiding some of the younger workers, overseeing the projects that involved the local community. It was exactly the kind of work he knew how to do, the kind that made him feel like he was part of something that mattered. But every time he crossed paths with Lila, that space between them felt like an ocean. They hadn't talked much, not about them, not about what had been, what could have been. And it felt like the longer they avoided it, the harder it would be to face. But today, as he made his way toward the central part of the site, something different hung in the air. Lila was standing by a pile of blueprints, a clipboard in hand, her brow furrowed as she spoke with one of the contractors. When she saw him, she offered a small, hesitant smile that barely touched the surface of the tension in her eyes. "Jake," she said, walking over, her boots crunching on the gravel. "I've got a new task for you today. We're behind on the landscaping. Need someone to help set up the garden space for the kids. Can you handle that?" Jake nodded, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "Yeah, sure, I can handle that." He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe a stilted exchange, maybe more of the cold distance they had been keeping. But when they moved to the garden area, things felt different. It wasn't just the work that brought them together. It was the shared task, the quiet moments as they dug into the earth, setting up the framework for a space that was meant for something better than what either of them had imagined before. There was an ease that came with the physical labor, something familiar, something grounding. Jake found himself talking, the words spilling out without thinking. He joked about the local kids he used to know, the trouble they'd get into, and Lila, to his surprise, laughed. Not the polite chuckle he'd heard from her before, but a genuine laugh that filled the space between them. "Yeah, they used to think the old baseball field was a jungle gym," Jake said, shaking his head. "I swear, half of them probably got their first stitches there." Lila laughed again, her eyes lighting up. "I remember doing the same thing at the community center. I'm sure my mom nearly had a heart attack every time I climbed the old jungle gym." "Some things never change," Jake said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he adjusted the post he was holding. "Just the next generation of kids causing trouble." The sound of their laughter filled the empty space between them, lighter than it had been in days. There was something comforting about it, something real, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt the barrier between them begin to crack. It wasn't about solving everything at once, about confronting everything that had been left unsaid. It was about working together, getting the job done. As they worked side by side, they fell into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was easier, and that small, quiet connection they shared started to seep back into their movements, their words, as they fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but not alone. When the sun finally set, casting long shadows across the site, they stood back, taking in the work they had done. The garden space was coming together, ready for the kids to run and play and learn. And as Jake looked over at Lila, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't there before, something softer, something hopeful. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe it wasn't enough. But for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The barn smelled like hay and dust, but tonight it was filled with the hum of voices, the clink of glasses, and the low, steady beat of a country song playing over the speakers. It wasn't supposed to be a formal event, just a small gathering for the workers, a thank you for all the late nights and hard days they'd put in at the site. But as Jake stepped inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the work that had brought them here. It was more. It always seemed to be more when Lila was around. She was standing by the punch table, laughing with a few of the other women from the community. Her hair was loose now, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, the tension she always carried in her posture softened by the glow of the barn's string lights. She looked different tonight, more relaxed, more at ease, and something in Jake's chest tightened as he watched her. She wasn't the polished, controlled woman who walked into his garage last week. Tonight she was the girl he remembered, the girl who laughed without holding back, who let herself breathe. As if she felt his gaze on her, Lila turned, her eyes locking with his across the room. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The world around them seemed to blur, the noise fading into the background, and all that was left was the space between them. She smiled, just a little, a slow curve of her lips that told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't running anymore. Neither of them were. Jake took a step forward, his boots crunching against the wood floor, and for a moment he wondered if he was dreaming, if the way she was looking at him was real. But when he reached her, she didn't say anything. She just held out her hand, palm up. And he didn't hesitate. The music changed, a slower song now, one that seemed to speak directly to the moment between them. He took her hand and led her to the center of the floor, the rest of the crowd fading away, leaving them in their own world, the soft glow of the barn's lights casting shadows across their faces. As they began to move, something in Jake's chest seemed to unclench. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it wasn't this. It wasn't the familiar feeling of Lila's hand resting in his, of the warmth of her body so close to his. It was like stepping back in time, like nothing had ever changed between them, like they could fall back into the rhythm of each other's presence without needing to speak. Lila's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, and they swayed together, the space between them closing as they moved in time with the music. For a moment, the years of silence, the walls they had built between them, seemed to dissolve. There was no past, no future. There was only now, only the feeling of her against him, the way her eyes softened, the way her breath mingled with his. "I didn't think we'd get here," Jake murmured, his voice low, his heart pounding in his chest. Lila looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Neither did I," she whispered, "but we're here now." And for the first time in a long time, Jake didn't feel like he was lost in the past or chasing something that was out of reach. He was here with her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't afraid. They danced like it was the first time again, like the world hadn't passed them by, like there was still time to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, there always had been. The barn had emptied out a while ago, the laughter and chatter fading into the night as people made their way home, tired but happy. Jake and Lila stayed behind, the quiet stretching between them like a bridge they had finally crossed. The music was turned off now, the soft hum of the evening settling in, the only sound their footsteps on the old wooden floor as they walked side by side toward the open door. The air outside was cool, fresh, with the promise of the coming night. It felt like a breath after being underwater for too long. Jake paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the doorframe, as he looked out into the vast open field beyond the barn. He hadn't realized how much he needed this, how much he needed the silence between them, the way the world felt smaller now that they were both finally looking at it the same way. Lila stood beside him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her eyes turned toward the stars. She was so close, and yet it felt like they were still a world apart. He could feel the pull between them, the weight of the unspoken words, the tension of all the years they had missed, the things they hadn't said, but both knew were still there. "You know," Lila began, her voice soft, almost hesitant, "I used to think about this, about being here with you, back when I left, when I thought I'd have it all figured out." Jake turned his head toward her, the words hanging in the air. "And now?" "Now, I don't have it all figured out." She turned to face him, the slight smile on her lips fading as she met his gaze. "But I think I'm finally ready to stop pretending I don't feel anything." He felt his breath catch in his throat, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long running from this, running from the truth of what they could have been, what they still could be. His heart raced as the space between them closed, his gaze never leaving hers. He had been afraid for so long, afraid of what it would mean to be vulnerable again, to let someone back in, especially her. But the fear was gone now, washed away by the shared moments, the quiet laughter, the way everything felt right, in a way that no amount of time or distance could erase. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was gentle, tentative, but it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her breath a little unsteady, her chest rising and falling with the same anticipation that seemed to be thickening the air around them. And then, just like that, the last wall between them crumbled. Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing against her skin, and for a brief moment, the world held its breath. Lila's eyes fluttered shut, and he could feel the tremor in her body, the same uncertainty he felt. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was the realization that maybe they had both been waiting for this, waiting for the moment when everything that had been held back could finally be released. The kiss came slow at first, testing, hesitant, like a question being asked that neither of them had the courage to speak out loud. But when she kissed him back, when her hands found their way to his chest, the world melted away. The years, the mistakes, the regrets, they didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the feeling of her against him, the warmth of her lips, the way everything inside him felt like it had finally fallen into place. It was real this time. There was no doubt, no hesitation. Just a quiet surrender to the moment, to the truth that had been there all along. And when they finally pulled away, breathless, the world seemed a little smaller, a little brighter. "No more fear," Jake whispered, his voice rough but steady, as he looked into her eyes. Lila smiled softly, her forehead resting against his. "No more fear," she echoed. The words of promise neither of them needed to speak again. The soft glow of the kitchen lights flickered above them as Jake leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on the floor. Layla stood in front of him, the quiet of the night stretching between them, heavy and thick with unsaid things. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze was distant, focused on the half-empty coffee cup in her hands. He could feel the weight of her presence in the room, the tension that had been building over the last few days, ever since the kiss, since the moment everything between them had shifted again. She cleared her throat, breaking the silence, but her voice was softer than usual. "Jake, I want you to come with me." The words landed heavy, unexpected, and the air in the room seemed to freeze. He looked up at her, not quite understanding. "What?" "I want you to come with me to the city," she repeated, her voice more firm now. "I'm building a life there. I've built a future there." Her eyes searched his face, like she was looking for some kind of confirmation. "I don't want to do it alone." Jake's heart skipped, a wave of panic crashing over him before he could suppress it. He wasn't prepared for this. Not now. Not when everything was finally starting to feel like it might actually work between them. "Lila," he started, but the words wouldn't come. She stepped closer, placing the coffee cup down on the counter, the gentle click of porcelain the only sound between them. "I've already got everything figured out, Jake. The place, the work, the opportunity for you. Everything. I've been trying to convince myself that I can build it all without you, but I can't. Not anymore. I want you there." Her voice wavered just a little as she reached for his hand. He didn't move. Her fingers brushed against his, and he felt the weight of her gaze on him. He could see it in her eyes, the hope, the rawness, the fear of offering something that might be rejected. She wanted him. She wanted him to step into her world, to leave behind everything he had built, everything he knew. But what would that even mean for him? What did it mean for them? "I can't just leave," he finally said, the words rough as they left his mouth. He pulled his hand away, shaking his head. "I've got this place. My life is here, my work, my family. It's not that simple." Lila's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made his chest tighten. "You think it's easy for me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You think I want to live in a world where you're not a part of it, where I'm still looking over my shoulder hoping you'll come back? I've waited for this, Jake. I've waited for you to finally see what I see." He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the weight of her words hanging in the air like an anchor pulling him down. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to be with her, to build something new, to take a chance. But the fear, the uncertainty, gripped him tightly. What if it wasn't enough? What if he wasn't enough for her in that world? What if he couldn't fit into the life she had built? "I don't know if I can leave this behind," he muttered, his voice thick with regret. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I'm not asking you to leave everything. I'm asking you to come with me. I want us to build something together. But I can't do that if you're too afraid to step forward." Her words stung, the truth of them like a sharp twist in his gut. He was afraid. Of course he was afraid. But that didn't change the fact that she was asking him to take a leap into a life he wasn't sure he could keep up with. "I need time," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I need time to think." Lila nodded, the faintest trace of disappointment in her eyes. She didn't say anything more, didn't push. She just stood there, her gaze soft, waiting for him to make a choice he wasn't ready to make. Jake stood by the window, staring out at the fading light as it stretched over the fields that bordered the town. The familiar sight, the rusted trucks on the side of the road, the half-empty diner, the old brick buildings lining the main street, had always felt like home. But tonight the town felt smaller somehow, as if everything he'd spent his life building had suddenly started to feel like something he needed to escape. Lila's words echoed in his mind, her offer to move to the city, to leave this place behind. She had tried to make it sound so easy, so full of opportunity, but the truth of it hit him in the chest like a punch. He didn't want to leave, not yet. Not when he could still see something in this town that needed fixing, that needed him. His fingers tightened around the edge of the windowsill as he thought about the people here, the ones who had never left, who had struggled the same way his father had, the same way he had. They didn't have the luxury of just packing up and moving on to something better. They had to make it work, or they didn't make it at all. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts, and he turned to see his nephew Sam standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his face serious. The kid had a way of reading Jake, always knowing when something was off. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" Sam's voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the question in his tone. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice low. "Lila, she wants me to come with her. She wants me to leave all of this behind and start fresh, but I can't just do that, not when there's so much here that still needs fixing." Sam took a step forward, his eyes narrowed, but with a look of understanding. "You don't want to leave, do you?" Jake shook his head, the weight of his decision sitting heavy on his chest. "No, I don't. But I don't know if staying here is enough anymore. I don't know if I'm enough." Sam's gaze softened, his arms dropping to his sides. "You don't have to go to the city to make things better, Uncle Jake. You can do it right here. You've been fixing things your whole life, fixing cars, fixing what's broken. Maybe it's time to fix this town." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had spent so many years telling himself that leaving, that moving on, was the only way to escape the weight of his past, the weight of the small life he'd built. But maybe Sam was right. Maybe the solution wasn't in running away. Maybe it was in staying and fighting for something better here, in the place that had shaped him. "I'm tired of running, Sam," Jake said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm tired of pretending like there's something better waiting for me somewhere else. This town, these people, they need something, and I think I'm the one who needs to be here to fix it." Sam smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to do it alone. We're all in this together." Jake felt a weight lift from his chest, a new sense of purpose settling into his bones. He wasn't sure what the future held, or if he was ready to build the life Lila wanted for them, but one thing was clear: he wasn't ready to walk away from this place. He couldn't. Not yet. "I'm going to make it work here," Jake said, more to himself than to Sam. "I'm going to make this town better. We all deserve that." And as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, Jake knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose, a real one, and he wasn't running from it anymore. Jake stood outside the garage, his hands shoved deep in his pockets as he stared at the new building across the lot. It wasn't just any new building, it was his. His heart beat faster as he let the reality of it sink in, the weight of it almost too much to bear. The space gleamed in the early morning light, fresh paint still drying on the walls. A brand new sign hanging proudly above the door with his name on it, Marshall's Auto Repair. He had worked in that tiny garage for years, fixing cars, rebuilding engines, scraping together enough money to keep it running. But this was different. This was more than he ever thought possible. This wasn't just a donation. It wasn't charity. It was a partnership. Something Lila had offered him without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. Lila had come to him a few weeks ago, her eyes steady but uncertain. She hadn't talked about it much, but Jake had seen the fear in her eyes. She wasn't offering him something out of pity. She was offering him a chance. A real chance to do something bigger than he ever could have imagined. "I want you to have this," she had said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something raw in the way she spoke, something vulnerable. "Not because you need it, Jake, but because I believe in you, and I believe in this town, in what it could be. You don't have to run anymore. You don't have to feel like you're stuck." At first, Jake had been too stunned to speak. The words felt foreign. He'd spent years fighting to stay afloat, telling himself he wasn't good enough for anything bigger than what he had. But this was different. This was a chance to rebuild, not just the garage, but the entire vision of what his life could be. And it wasn't something handed to him. It was something earned. Now, standing there, looking at the new building, Jake felt the weight of Lila's offer. She hadn't just funded a new shop. She had given him a new future, one that would be his, one he could take ownership of. And it wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It was about fixing what had been broken inside him, about trusting in himself again. When Lila had told him, "This is yours. We'll build it together," she had meant it. She hadn't just handed him a gift, she had extended an invitation, one that meant something more than a business venture. It was a promise, a partnership that wasn't about her success, but about both of them creating something real. He walked up to the door, his fingers brushing against the new sign, feeling the smooth surface of it under his touch. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he felt something inside him shift. There was no more running, no more pretending. This was it. This was what he had been waiting for, and when he stepped inside the new shop with all the shiny new tools, the bright overhead lights, the space that seemed too big for him to fill, he knew deep down that he wasn't just fixing cars anymore. He was fixing the dream he had put on hold for far too long. Jake sat on the porch, the quiet hum of the evening wrapping around him like a blanket, the stars just starting to prick the sky. He could hear the distant sound of crickets, the rustling of the wind through the trees. But most of all, he heard the silence between him and Lila. It had been there for days now, since the new shop had opened, since the shift in their lives had begun to settle in. Lila stood at the edge of the porch, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her gaze cast down toward the dirt road that led into town. She was quiet, but not distant. There was a calm about her now, a peace that seemed to settle over everything, as if they had reached some unspoken understanding that the past was no longer something to fight against. He had spent so much of his life wishing he could change it, the way they'd parted, the way he had let fear dictate everything, the years that had passed, the lives they'd lived separately. He thought about how many times he'd imagined what it would have been like if he had done things differently, if he had shown up when she needed him, if he had let her in instead of pushing her away. But tonight, as he sat next to her, there was no bitterness, no longing, just the quiet understanding that they had both carried the weight of the past long enough. "I used to think about what we could have been," Lila said, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Jake turned his head to look at her, the words from so many years ago suddenly hanging in the air between them. "Yeah, me too." He paused, his hands resting on his knees, as if the weight of his own thoughts had made his body heavy. "I used to think that maybe if I had just done it differently, maybe if I had gone after you, things would have turned out better. But I don't think about that anymore." Lila's eyes met his, her gaze steady, unwavering. "We didn't get to choose back then, Jake. We were different people. We couldn't have known what we were missing or what it would cost us." He felt a lump form in his throat, something raw and unspoken that had been building for years. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have fought for us. I should have seen what we could have had, but I was too afraid. I was too afraid to lose what I had here." Lila reached out, her fingers brushing against his. It was small, simple, but it felt like everything in that moment. She gave him a small smile, one that spoke more than any words could. "It's not too late, Jake." He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, And for the first time in years, the weight of the past seemed to lift just a little. They weren't erasing what had happened between them, but they were finally letting go of it. They weren't going to rewrite their history, but they could finally find peace with it. What they could have been no longer mattered. What mattered now was what they were, what they could be, together. And that, in the quiet of the night, was enough.